The creak of a bed became the unlikely soundtrack to the birth of a new Russia, echoing through the Moscow night, compelling venerable boyars to cross themselves and foreign diplomats to scribble notes in their dispatches. There, behind the high fence of the German quarter, in the arms of a dazzling foreign beauty, the young Tsar was losing not only his head, but it seemed his very will to rule. The courtiers whispered that this was not passion, but a demonic obsession, a dangerous game in which the fate of an entire nation had been wagered. We have been told a beautiful legend of a great reformer and his muse, but the most crucial parts were omitted: the price he was willing to pay, and the woman who held not only the sovereign's heart, but also the strings to some of the darkest conspiracies of the age. Prepare yourselves. We are about to lift the curtain on one of the most scandalous and classified stories of the House of Romanov. This is not merely a love story, it is a true historical investigation, where we will walk the razor's edge between official chronicles and the secret dispatches of spies. Was Anna Mons merely a greedy adventuress, as she is often portrayed, or was she a brilliant political player, a shadow queen whose influence extended far beyond the royal bedchamber? We will examine interrogation records, pore over the lines of her letters, and uncover the shocking truth hidden behind the glitter of diamonds and the roar of patrine victories. This story will force you to see the birth of the Russian Empire and the man we consider its sole father in an entirely new light. To grasp the scale of this drama, we must for a moment leave the dusty chambers of the Kremlin and transport ourselves to an entirely different world that existed right in the middle of Moscow. Imagine an island of Europe surrounded by an invisible wall of cultural difference. The German Quarter, or Kukuy, as it was derisively known by the common folk. It was a state within a state, a portal to another dimension. Here, the air smelled not of incense and cabbage soup, but of grilled sausages, the bitter hops of fresh beer, and the sharp smoke of Dutch tobacco. Instead of the morning chime of church bells, one heard the sound of violins and the German tongue. Along the neat, almost toy-like streets, men strolled in tight-fitting breeches and women in dresses that would have been considered the height of indecency in the rest of Russia. The quarter was a canister of oxygen for those suffocating in the stifling atmosphere of old Muscovite traditions. For the aristocracy, it was a place of forbidden pleasures. For the young Tsar Peter, it was a window into the world he dreamed of building. And the unofficial queen of this small European kingdom was she, Anna Mons. She was born into the family of a prosperous wine merchant, Johann Georg Mons, a pragmatic and business-minded man. From childhood, her world had nothing in common with the gilded cage of the harem where her Russian peers languished. While Muscovite noblewomen learned embroidery and were kept under lock and key, their faces coated in thick layers of white lead paint with unnatural crimson apples of rouge on their cheeks, Anna and her sister Matryona studied languages, learned to dance, and mastered the art of witty conversation. They did not braid their hair into tight plaits, but styled it in fashionable European coiffures. They did not hide their figures under shapeless sarafans, but accentuated them with narrow corsets and daring décolletage. Anna was the embodiment of life, energy, and freedom. Her laugh was loud and infectious, her gaze direct and confident. She was not the submissive, silent shadow of a man. She was a vibrant personality, capable of charming, captivating, and, if need be, leading. It was this striking difference, this raw, irrepressible vitality, that made her a magnet for men who had grown weary of the drowsy, identical beauties of the boyar clans. The key that unlocked this alluring world for Peter was his closest companion, the Genevan adventurer Franz Yakovlevich Lefort. A brilliant soldier, a charming conversationalist, and a connoisseur of all European pleasures, Lefort was Peter's mentor, friend, and, in essence, his guide to civilization. It was he, a frequent guest at the Mons household, who first recognized the potential of the young Anna. Contemporaries whispered that Franz and Anna shared more than just friendship, though no proof exists. Whatever the case, it was Lefort who, in 1690, decided to introduce his 18-year-old sovereign to the most brilliant pearl of the German quarter. He brought to the wine merchant's house not just a Tsar, but a young man torn apart by inner demons. Peter, for all his unbridled energy, was a deeply lonely and insecure man. Awkwardly tall, with a disproportionately small head and a nervous tic, he inspired more fear than affection in most. His lawful wife, Eudoxia Lopukhina, was a typical product of the old system, pious, narrow-minded, and utterly incapable of understanding or sharing his tempestuous ambitions. And so, into this world brimming with freedom and novelty, burst Peter. For him, meeting Anna was like a lightning strike. He saw more than just a beautiful girl. He saw in her the living embodiment of his dream of a new Russia, free, educated, liberated, European. In her laughter, he heard the anthem of future victories. In her open gaze, the promise of a different, joyful life. The Tsar fell in love instantly, recklessly, and with all the fury of his indomitable nature. But for Anna, this encounter was apparently no revelation. Before her stood not a mighty monarch, but a strange, twitchy youth, strikingly different from the polished European officers to whose attention she was accustomed. His enormous hands, his tiny feet, his frightening intensity, all of it, as malicious tongues claimed, provoked in her not awe, but rather bewilderment and even a slight revulsion. That evening, the story of a great passion began, but from the very start, it was a game with asymmetrical stakes. He was ready to lay an empire at her feet. She, however, saw only another admirer, albeit a very highly placed one. Anna's initial bewilderment, if it existed, was no obstacle for the hurricane that was Peter Alexeyevich. The events of that October evening in 1691, when the Tsar and Lefort were feasting at the Mons home, have become the stuff of legend. According to one version, eagerly retold in the quarter, a lengthy courtship was not required. After a few goblets of Hungarian wine, the young monarch, who tolerated no delay in matters of state or heart, simply took the German beauty by the hand and led her into a private room. This decisive, almost primitive act was the point of no return. From that moment, protocol, propriety, and even his lawful wife ceased to exist for Peter. He began visiting the Mons home regularly, turning their hospitable house into his unofficial residence and a source of strength. Here, he shed the heavy burden of the autocrat, took off his uniform, and became simply Petrusha, a young man craving warmth and understanding. Anna gave him what he was denied in his official life: lightness, joy, and absolute acceptance of his boisterous nature free from the affectations and grimaces of the court. His legitimate life with Tsarina Eudoxia Lopukhina became a burdensome duty. Eudoxia was a living monument to the past that Peter hated with all his soul and sought to destroy. She was flesh and blood of the world of Terem's, boyar conspiracies, superstitions, and endless prayer services. In her presence, he could physically feel the shackles of old Rus binding him hand and foot. Her every sigh, every pious word, her fear of all things new and foreign, it was all like the screech of an ungreased cart, hindering his frantic race into the future. From 1692, he practically ceased to share her bed, and their rare encounters turned into scenes of his own sullen irritation and her silent tears. Anna was his oxygen, his personal grand embassy to the world of normal human relationships. And very soon, a plan of unprecedented audacity ripened in his mind. He would divorce his loathsome wife and place his Kukuy Tsarina on the throne. This idea caused a tectonic shift at court. To marry a foreigner, and a German trollop at that, as the boyars hissed behind his back, was not just a breach of tradition. It was a challenge to the entire system, a spit in the face of the Orthodox Church and the hereditary aristocracy. The main bastion against this mad plan was the Tsar's mother, Natalia Kirillovna Naryshkina. The Dowager Tsarina, a powerful and conservative woman, saw Anna Mons not as her son's mistress, but as a fiend from hell, a Lutheran heretic who had bewitched her Petrusha and was pushing him into an abyss. There began endless admonitions, arguments that turned into shouting matches, motherly tears, and pleas not to disgrace the family, not to anger God, not to cast a shadow on Monomach's cap. Peter, who could bring entire regiments to their knees, faltered before his mother's grief. He retreated, postponing his decision, but not abandoning it. And in 1694, after Natalia Kirillovna passed away, it seemed the last obstacle had fallen. But history had other plans. The Tsar was engulfed by preparations for the Azov campaigns, and then for his grand journey to Europe. Thoughts of marriage were pushed aside. August 1698. Peter, having cut short his grand embassy upon news of the Streltsy uprising, returns to Moscow. He has changed. This is no longer the enthusiastic youth who left Russia. He has seen Europe, gained experience, and become harder, more cynical, and even more resolute. All of Moscow held its breath, waiting. Where would the sovereign go after his long absence? To his lawful wife in the Kremlin, as custom demanded? But Peter, barely shaking off the road dust, rode not to Tsarina Eudoxia. He went straight to the German quarter, to his Anna. It was a public statement, a deafening slap in the face to the entire old order. For Eudoxia, this was the final straw. She had waited for her husband, hoped for reconciliation, and received a humiliation that the entire capital was talking about the very next day. The week that followed became legendary. It was said that the Tsar and his favorite did not leave the bedchamber, making up for the lost time of their years apart. And on September 3rd, emerging from his lover's embrace, Peter delivered the final verdict on his own past. He gave the order Tsarina Eudoxia Fyodorovna Lopukhina was to be forcibly tonsured as a nun and imprisoned in the Suzdal Pokrovsky monastery. Thus, with a single stroke of the pen, a living woman was turned into a living corpse. The path for Anna Mons was clear. Now, nothing stood in her way to the Russian throne. After the creak of the monastery gates behind Eudoxia signaled the end of an old era, Anna Mons's personal golden age began. Peter, as if trying to compensate for years of waiting and humiliation, unleashed a torrent of gold upon his beloved. Gifts followed one after another, each more lavish than the last. These were not mere tokens of affection, but a demonstration of her new, almost royal status. He gave her the rarest of jewels, gowns made from the most expensive European fabrics, thoroughbred horses, and carriages that other European princesses might envy. The pinnacle of this generosity was a miniature portrait of the Tsar himself, studded with diamonds of such purity and size that its value was rumored to exceed 1,000,000 rubles, an astronomical sum for the time. This portrait was not just an ornament, it was a symbol of power, almost like a scepter or an orb. To wear it was to be publicly acknowledged, to be the one and only. But Peter went even further. He decided that his chosen one should no longer be cooped up in her wine merchant father's house. At state expense, with no regard for the cost, a luxurious 2-story stone mansion began to rise for her in the heart of the German quarter. It was the first building in Moscow constructed in the fashionable Dutch style, with large windows, a high roof, and an elegant facade. The Mons Palace, as it was immediately dubbed, became the architectural embodiment of her triumph, the visible proof of her influence over the Tsar. In addition to this, she was granted an official pension of 708 rubles a year, placing her income on par with the highest aristocracy. And the cherry on top, several villages with serfs in the Kozelsky district, which transformed her, the simple daughter of a German merchant, into a Russian landowner. In 1703, when the palace was completed, Peter took a step unthinkable for the times. He openly moved in with his lover. The Tsar of all Rus began to live with his mistress in sin, without hiding, in full view of all Moscow, as if defying both the boyar councils and the patriarch's curses. However, behind this dazzling facade of success, deep cracks were already beginning to show. Despite all the gifts and public recognition, Peter somehow delayed the most important step. The talk of marriage, which he had so passionately pursued before, faded away. He showered her with wealth, made her an unofficial Tsarina, but never brought himself to make her the official one. Perhaps he intuitively sensed what all of Moscow already saw. The common people, with their unerring instinct for falsehood, never accepted Anna and came to despise her with a fierce hatred. They saw in her not the muse of a reformer, but a foreign predator, a drain on the treasury, and the chief cause of the suffering of the martyred Tsarina Eudoxia. Behind her back, she was contemptuously called Monsika, and her new palace was the Devil's Sanctuary. The nickname Kukuy Tsarina was not a compliment, but a condemnation. The common people, crushed by taxes and military levies, could not understand or forgive her ostentatious luxury. While the country strained to build a fleet and fight the Swedes, the favorite bathed in gold, and this gold seemed stolen from their own pockets. But the main problem was not the people's dislike, but Anna herself. Something in their relationship had broken. Something important was gone. She had received everything she seemingly could have dreamed of: wealth, status, power. But she did not give Peter the one thing that mattered most: sincere love in return. Their correspondence has survived, and it is striking in its cold pragmatism. In her letters to the Tsar, Anna never writes of feelings, never shares her thoughts. Each of her messages is essentially a business document. She asks for money for herself, secures lucrative positions for her relatives, lobbies for privileges for her foreign friends. She behaves not like a loving woman, but like a skilled lobbyist at the court of an all-powerful ruler. This emotional coldness could not go unnoticed for long. Peter, for all his crudeness, was a passionate and vulnerable man. He needed more than just a beautiful, kept woman. He needed a soulmate, a comrade in arms. Instead, he increasingly found himself with a calculating and insatiable creditor, presenting ever-new bills for her favor. The air around the brilliant couple gradually thickened, and catastrophe was only a matter of time. While the official chronicles painted an idyllic picture of royal love, a very different drama was unfolding behind the scenes. The most perceptive observers at court had long noticed that the relationship between Peter and Anna was a one-man show. All the passion, all the tenderness, all the energy in this union came from the Tsar alone. She merely allowed herself to be loved, accepting his feelings as a given, like another expensive gift to be placed in a jewelry box. The French naval officer François Villebois, whom Peter had invited to serve Russia, left a devastatingly accurate description in his memoirs. He wrote that Peter would have married Anna without hesitation if she had reciprocated even 1/100th of the all-consuming love he felt for her. But while she showed him outward favor, she displayed not a shred of genuine affection. Moreover, Villebois, citing some secret sources, stated outright, Anna Mons harbored a hidden revulsion for her royal patron, which, despite all her caution, sometimes broke through to the surface. And the sovereign, according to the memoirist, had noticed it several times. One can only imagine Peter's state of mind. The man who was breaking age-old traditions over his knee, commanding armies, and changing the country's geography was, in his personal life, helpless and vulnerable. He felt this coldness, saw that empty gaze, but likely refused to believe the worst until the very end. He could attribute her detachment to anything: fatigue, feminine whims, a difference in mentality. But he could not and would not admit the truth. The woman for whom he had renounced his past, exiled his wife, and challenged the entire country, simply did not love him. She was using him, enduring his embraces, perhaps even despising him as a coarse and clumsy barbarian. The thought was so monstrous that his conscious mind probably blocked it. But subconsciously, he understood everything, and this internal conflict, this rot at the very heart of his personal world, made him even more explosive, suspicious, and cruel. He was living on a volcano that could erupt at any moment. And for an eruption, all that was needed was the right detonator. That detonator came in the form of a tragic accident, which set off a chain of irreversible events. On April 11th, 1703, in Schlüsselburg, just recaptured from the Swedes, a lavish feast was in full swing. They were celebrating the launch of the repaired royal yacht, a landmark event for the young Russian Navy. Among the guests was the Saxon envoy to the Russian court, a certain Herr Königsegg. The merriment was at its peak. Wine flowed freely. At some point, Königsegg, having had too much to drink, went out onto the pier for some fresh air, missed his step, and fell into the icy, dark waters of the Neva River. His disappearance was not noticed immediately, and by the time they realized, it was too late. The powerful current carried the unfortunate diplomat's body away, and it was not found until late that autumn. It seemed like a common accident, of which there were many in that turbulent era. As per protocol, the drowned man's belongings were inventoried and seized for subsequent shipment to his relatives in Saxony. And it was here that the first strange detail surfaced. Among Koenigseck's personal effects was found an elegant woman's locket, unmistakably identified as a gift once given to Anna Mons by the Tsar himself. How did it end up with the Saxon envoy? This question demanded an immediate answer. The strange finding was promptly reported to Peter. In his soul, already tormented by suspicion, this news exploded like a bomb. He gave a short and terrible order to immediately open and inspect all of the late Koenigseck's personal belongings, every box and travel trunk. What the Tsar's bloodhounds discovered surpassed his worst fears. In one of the caskets, under a false bottom, lay a neatly ribbon-tied bundle of letters. It was a secret love correspondence, and the author of these ardent, tender, passion-filled missives was she, his Anna, his Kukuy Tsarina. She had written to another man the words that Peter himself had never heard from her. His entire world, built on the illusion of this love, collapsed in an instant. The sovereign's rage was indescribable. It was the eruption of that long-dormant volcano. He ordered Menshikov to be placed under the strictest house arrest immediately and to have all his gifts confiscated. The curtain fell on the golden age of Anna Mons with a deafening crash. Infidelity was the one sin Peter never forgave from anyone. The fall of the Kukuy Tsarina was as swift and stunning as her rise. Just yesterday, she was the most influential woman in the state, the mistress of a luxurious palace, a trendsetter, and an object of envy. Today, she was a despised prisoner in her own home. Her mansion, once a symbol of triumph, became her prison, guarded by soldiers. Anna wept, wrote penitent letters, begged for forgiveness, and swore eternal fidelity. But it was all in vain. She was facing not just the anger of a deceived lover, but the icy fury of an insulted monarch. For Peter, her act was not merely a personal offense, but high treason. He, the Tsar, had been publicly humiliated, made a laughingstock, and he could not forgive it. Anna Mons's star had set, and on the horizon of his life, a new, completely different star was already rising. As fate would have it, Peter found solace in the arms of a woman who was the complete opposite of his former favorite. By 1705, the sovereign had a new love, a simple Baltic peasant girl named Martha Skavronskaya, a captive seized by Russian troops during the storming of Marienburg. Martha, the future Empress Catherine I, possessed neither Anna's aristocratic polish nor her European education. She was a woman of the people, simple, somewhat coarse, but endowed with a priceless gift, the gift of unconditional love and absolute devotion. Unlike the cold and calculating Mons, Martha adored her Petruchia. She did not demand diamonds and palaces from him. She gave him what no treasure could buy: warmth, care, and peace of mind. Catherine was the only person who knew how to handle the Tsar's terrifying nervous seizures. When Peter's violent convulsions and headaches began, she would take him onto her lap, cradle his head, and whisper something gentle, and he would calm down like a child, falling asleep on her breast. She became not only his lover, but also his mother, sister, and comrade in arms. She shared all the hardships of his military campaigns, slept in a tent, and ate from a soldier's pot. She was his shadow, his support, his safe harbor. This new, mature, and profound love softened Peter's heart. He became kinder, more tolerant, and perhaps wiser. Against the backdrop of this newfound happiness, the affair with Anna Mons already seemed like a petty, annoying episode from the past. In 1706, likely persuaded by Catherine, the sovereign eased the conditions of his former favorite's confinement. She was allowed to leave her house to attend the Lutheran church. It seemed a chance for Anna to lie low, to lead a quiet, inconspicuous life, waiting for the Tsar's anger to completely subside. But her defiant and restless nature failed her once again. She could not accept the loss of power and wealth. Instead of praying in church, she decided to win back the Tsar's favor through witchcraft. This move was the height of recklessness. At a time when Peter was waging a merciless war against superstition and prejudice, turning to sorcery was tantamount to treason. Menshikov hired some local charlatan to cast a spell that would bind the sovereign's heart to her. Word of this immediately reached the proper authorities. A new case of sorcery was opened. Arrests and interrogations began. 30 people from Anna's circle were thrown into dungeons, many subjected to brutal torture to extract confessions. The clouds gathered once more over the former favorite's head, and this time she faced not just imprisonment, but the executioner's block. But it seems fate had other plans for her. Peter, busy with the war against Sweden and the construction of his new capital, did not want to escalate the scandal. Perhaps a remnant of his former feelings stirred within him, or maybe he simply considered her act a pathetic folly, unworthy of serious punishment. In the end, he ordered her famous mansion to be confiscated by the state, but allowed her to keep some of her jewelry, as well as her horses and carriages. In 1707, the case was quietly closed. Anna Mons had once again escaped unscathed. She had been fantastically lucky, but she failed to understand the most important thing. Her time was irrevocably gone. The Tsar Peter Alexeyevich she once knew no longer existed. Another woman was by his side, and in his heart there was no room left for Anna. It would seem that by putting an end to his relationship with Anna, Peter should have erased her from his life forever. He had found happiness with Martha. He was building an empire. He was fighting a war. He had more than enough to occupy him. But the psychology of a rejected man is a complex and unpredictable thing, even if that man is an autocrat. He no longer loved Anna, perhaps even despised her, but some dark, possessive streak in his soul would not let him release her completely. She was his trophy, albeit a tarnished one, and the thought that this trophy might fall into someone else's hands was unbearable to him. He behaved like a dog in the manger. He wouldn't have her, but no one else could either. This strange, painful jealousy of the past erupted into one of the most outrageous and absurd diplomatic scandals of the era. The main character in this story, besides Peter and Anna, was the Prussian envoy, Johann von Kaiserling. He had long been, and by all accounts sincerely, in love with the disgraced favorite, and so, believing the Tsar's wrath had subsided, he dared to take a desperate step to ask for Anna Mons's hand in marriage. Understanding the delicacy of the situation, von Keyserling decided to act through the most influential man in the state after the Tsar, His Serene Highness Prince Alexander Danilovich Menshikov. He went to Menshikov and, after professing his passionate love for Anna, asked him to petition the sovereign for permission to marry. The reaction of the half-sovereign lord was completely unexpected. Instead of diplomatically smoothing things over, Menshikov exploded. He attacked the stunned envoy with his fists and a torrent of vulgar curses. A few moments later, Peter himself appeared, evidently summoned by Menshikov. What happened next was more like a scene from a slapstick carnival than a reception in the royal chambers. The Tsar and his closest associate, the two most powerful men in Russia, together began to beat the Prussian diplomat. A desperate letter has survived, which the humiliated von Keyserling later wrote to his king, Frederick I. In it, he described with horror and outrage how Menshikov shouted that the wench Mons is a vile public woman with whom he himself had debauched as much as I had. In his letter, the envoy complained that his sword was discreetly taken from him and his servants were removed, after which the Tsar and the prince, ignoring the pleas of Chancellor Shafirov, attacked him with the harshest words and threw me not only out of the room, but even down the stairs and across the entire square. This was unheard of. The top officials of the state personally beating and disgracefully expelling the official representative of another power. The scandal threatened to escalate into a full-blown international conflict. Von Keyserling, insulted to the core, demanded satisfaction. He could not, of course, challenge the Tsar to a duel, but he immediately sent a challenge to Menshikov. His Serene Highness, who feared neither man nor devil on the battlefield, cowardly declined the duel of honor. Russian diplomats had to urgently smooth over the situation. Eventually, they found scapegoats. The guards on duty were declared guilty of the brawl for supposedly failing to prevent the conflict. The unfortunate servicemen were promptly sentenced to death for dereliction of duty. Fortunately for everyone, especially the guards, King Frederick I of Prussia proved to be the only sane person in this whole wild affair. He did not want a war over his envoy's love life. His Majesty officially considered the conflict resolved and, as a sign of reconciliation, asked Peter to pardon the condemned soldiers. The Russian Tsar, with enormous relief and pleasure, granted the request of his brother Frederick. But the main result of this scandal was unexpected. Peter, having vented his rage and apparently realizing the absurdity of his behavior, finally got over his jealousy. It was as if he had placed a final, definitive period on this story. Suddenly, he gave his highest consent for the marriage of Anna Mons and von Keyserling. The wedding took place in Moscow in June 1711. It seemed that a new, quiet life was beginning for Anna, but fate, or the doom that pursued her, had other plans. Just a couple of months after the wedding, her husband, having traveled to Berlin on business, died unexpectedly. Before she could even enjoy her status as the respectable wife of a European diplomat, Anna Mons was a widow. Left a widow, Anna Johannovna did not grieve for long. Her pragmatic nature took over, and she plunged headfirst into more earthly matters. After her husband's passing, she entered into a long and fierce legal battle with his brother, the Land Marshal of the Prussian court. The bone of contention was the late von Kaiserling's rich estate in Courland, which the relative considered his rightful property. Anna, armed with a marriage contract, fought for her rights. The case dragged on, surrounded by rumors and gossip. In Courland, where Anna's reputation was well known, she earned a new nickname, Insatiable Anna. But her tenacity and persistence paid off. In 1714, the judicial board finally ruled in her favor. The estate was handed over to her, and she instantly became a very wealthy and independent woman. Now, she was not just the former favorite of the Russian Tsar, but a rich landowner, an eligible bachelorette around whom a swarm of new admirers immediately began to circle. It was during this period, at the twilight of her turbulent life, that she seems to have experienced true, all-consuming love for the first time. Her chosen one was a young Swedish captain, Carl Johann von Miller, who had been taken prisoner during the Great Northern War. What did she see in this blonde, handsome man? Perhaps he reminded her of the elegant European cavaliers she had admired in her youth. Or perhaps, tired of powerful and coarse men, she sought tenderness and adoration in him. Whatever the case, the Kukuy Tsarina fell head over heels in love with all the passion that Peter had never received from her. She was ready to do anything for her young lover. The culmination of this late romance was an almost insane act. She drew up a will in which she bequeathed her entire vast fortune, including the hard-won estate, to the Swedish captain. The woman who had been accused of cold calculation and greed her entire life, at the end of her journey, committed an act of absolute selflessness in the name of love. But fate allotted her very little time to enjoy this newfound happiness. Her health, undermined by years of stress and a tumultuous lifestyle, began to decline rapidly. Doctors diagnosed her with consumption, a swift form of tuberculosis that was a death sentence in those days. Her happiness in the arms of the young Swede was as brief as a flash of light. In the late summer of that same year, 1714, 42-year-old Anna Mons passed away. She was buried in the German quarter, in the very world that had created her and to which she remained faithful to the end. Peter Alexeyevich, who was in St. Petersburg at the time, received the news of her passing. He did not utter a single word, showed no emotion. He did not attend the funeral of the woman who had once meant everything to him. This silence was more eloquent than any words. The story of their relationship was finally over, and to fully understand who this woman was, we must return one last time to her origins. There were 4 children in the Mons family, and all of them, like their parents, were products of the unique atmosphere of the German quarter. It was a world where what was valued was not noble birth and piety, but enterprise, wit, and the ability to enjoy life. Here, morals were freely European, and for some, frankly, dissolute. Men did not wear beards. Girls did not hide their faces, and laughter in a tavern was considered more decent than sanctimonious sighs in a church. Anna Mons was neither an angel nor a demon. She was a daughter of her time and her environment, pragmatic, freedom-loving, appreciative of worldly goods, and not prone to empty sentiment. History made her a pawn in a great political game and brought her together with a man of titanic scale whom she simply could not match. She never became a Russian Tsarina, remaining in the nation's memory as the eternal Kukuy Tsarina. brilliant, foreign, and never truly understood.